أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. On this auspicious Jum'ah, I address you just weeks after a dramatic victory by the Taliban in Afghanistan over an empire, despite the sophisticated technology and expansive reach that the imperialist power had. Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of the unprecedented attacks on the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York City. That incident, devastating as it was in the instantaneous loss of life, left an indelible mark on global politics, as it laid the foundation for the global war on terror plotted by the ultra-conservative hawks in the American administration. Post-Cold War, American neoconservatives had promoted the notion that the United States was the lone superpower and should therefore actively and aggressively wield its weight worldwide on an expansionist expedition, redesigning the global stage, asserting hegemonic dominance over natural resources, and protecting their imperialist interests. The attack on the Twin Towers was the perfect occurrence to provide the justification and rationale for drawing the world into a war, waged under the pretext and ruse of defending civilization against barbarism, while building the defense contracts of private military corporations. The United Nations Security Council passed 2 resolutions on terrorism between the attacks on September 11th and the declaration of war on Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001, neither of which gave the authority for war, and both of which were absent of the accepted term, by all means necessary. Lacking the legitimate international legal bases for the rampant vengeance, the United States and its allies concocted justifications for invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, creating most wanted lists and embarking on hunts of human beings they deemed a threat to the empire. "You're either with us or against us," were the infamous words of George W. Bush. By the time of those attacks on US soil, Afghanistan had already been ravaged by a decade of war beginning in 1978, when the Saur Revolution brought the Afghan Communist Party to power in a military coup, followed by the Soviet invasion in support of the communist regime a year later. Upon the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, the country erupted into civil war as rival Mujahideen factions, tribal warlord fiefs, bandits, and criminal elements wreaked havoc, terrorizing the general public with impunity, as the central government lacked the ability to govern beyond the capital. Amidst the chaos, and perhaps in direct response to the appalling conditions, a zealous group of young religious scholars and former Mujahideen emerged as Taliban, or students, seeking to bring a sense of order. They soon swept across the country, consolidating power with a straightforward agenda to establish a sense of safety and security, as well as justice by disarming the populace. Through stringent laws that sought to address the moral decay and reinstate virtuousness, they implemented Sharia. The strict code of conduct appeared draconian to the outside world, and within Afghanistan, pockets of resistance emerged, fueled by warlords and narcotics dealers who benefited from the chaos. By 1994, the Taliban had a formidable unified force and seized Kandahar, which remains their stronghold to date. By 1995, they captured Herat, and a year later held the capital Kabul. Although the Taliban was not fully integrated and accepted into the community of nations when they swept to power in 1996, the United States explored their own national interests with the group, flying some of the leadership to Texas, then governed by George W. Bush, to meet with oil conglomerates who were keen to expand their interests in the Central Asian region, predicting that by building pipelines, access to the Caspian oil and gas, Afghanistan had the potential to become like Saudi Arabia. These plans, however, were threatened and derailed as suspicions grew around the Taliban hosting Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden, who had fought alongside the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. A strategic alliance appeared to have been formed between the ruling Taliban and Al-Qaeda, who ran training camps in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, a band of rebel warlords known as the Northern Alliance presented a formidable opposition to the Taliban rule on their home soil as another civil war erupted. On 9 September 2001, in the first suicide attack recorded in Afghanistan, Ahmed Shah Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance, was assassinated. The Taliban was on the verge of victory, but on the other side of the globe, 2 days later, the world transformed and Afghanistan was to become the epicenter of the global war on terror. As George W. Bush stated, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them," a direct implication that the Taliban government would bear the responsibility together with the perpetrators and alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden. Within the Taliban, there were differences of opinion as to whether or not to continue the fight against yet another superpower or to hand over Osama bin Laden. Driven by Islamic ethos and deeply rooted tribal integrity, the leadership would only agree to deliver the wanted man to the Americans if the US would guarantee a fair trial and due legal process. The United States hawks were out for blood and wanted his execution. These were unacceptable terms for the principled Taliban. The American invasion of Afghanistan, supported by their NATO allies, brought unrelenting devastation and destruction to a country already wrought by war. War profiteers and the military-industrial complex were built on the notion that international law and rules did not apply to the US and coalition partners. Cluster munitions, predator drones, missiles, and bombs, including what was known as daisy cutters, were used to obliterate villages. In addition to Marines and Special Forces, a new band of private military security firms that acted beyond the scope of the law were deployed, including the now infamous Blackwater. By installing a corrupt regime and developing an urbanized elite class, as well as embarking on public relations drives that rallied the conservative base, the US and its allies propagated the false notion that in addition to eradicating terror networks, the war was a means to liberate Afghans from their uncivilized leaders and to bring democracy to people, especially women. Laura Bush and Cherie Blair, together with feminist organizations in the US and UK, supported the war and rallied for funding towards this goal, as if bombing would liberate women. For the women in Afghanistan, particularly those in rural areas, this war brought even worse devastation than they had endured before. In addition to rape, targeted killings, villages razed, the women were further humiliated by the humanitarian aid processes that favored women who claimed to have been adversely affected by the Taliban rule. Soon, starving women cottoned on to the unofficial requirements and developed imaginary stories to tell to the Western aid workers in support of their claims to aid. This war was limitless and not bound by borders. This war extended across continents into people's homes and lives with warrantless wiretapping, surveillance, racial profiling, mass arrests of Muslims, Islamophobia, extraordinary renditions, enhanced interrogation and torture, targeted drone attacks, proxy wars, and the incomparable curtailing of civil liberties. Terminology such as violent extremism, terrorists, and enemy combatants became synonymous with Muslims. Branding any opposition group as terrorist also became a convenient means to suppress dissent worldwide. The creation of black sites and clandestine gulags for arbitrary detention of any person suspected of collaboration with the perceived enemy, as well as the establishment of Guantanamo Bay Prison outside of the Geneva Conventions and beyond the legal scope of the United States Constitution, stripping detainees of their rights, is a further ignominy to the empire. In Afghanistan, the Americans dropped flyers out of helicopters, offering rewards and ransoms to anyone who would hand over terror suspects. Anyone seen to be sporting a Casio watch, for example, similar to the one worn by Osama bin Laden, was deemed a terrorist. The Northern Alliance hoped to curry favor with the US and rounded up civilians, held them in the most horrific and inhumane conditions, before handing them over to the US, who then held many in Bagram, tortured them, and from where several Afghans and foreign nationals were renditioned to Guantanamo Bay to face indefinite imprisonment without access to a fair trial. Detainees were subjected to brutal interrogation techniques that were designed by capitalist psychologists Mitchell and Jensen. This was a means to authorize and legitimize torture, including waterboarding, sleep deprivation, music torture, forced rectal feeding, isolation, beatings, and threats. The harrowing stories are now emerging from former detainees who have told their stories. Former US government agents have also revealed the dark history of how the architects of the global war on terror garnered support by demonizing Muslims and constructing a framework of laws and policies in violation of international law and the Geneva Convention. Across the world, countries pandered to the US war on terror by acceding to international frameworks against terrorism and by introducing domestic legislation to support the concept of counterterrorism, although most were grounded in Islamophobia. Several countries supported the extraordinary rendition of citizens, eroding the rule of law. This was basically kidnapping people and shipping them off into the gulags. Many countries colluded with the US in hosting the black sites. Mercenaries, including from South Africa, were employed to fight or support the illegal invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. As the war expanded into Africa, many more have had free rein on the continent despite South African legislation in the form of the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act and the subsequent prohibition of mercenary activities and regulation of certain activities in countries of armed conflict. Beyond the draconian laws, the global war on terror gave ammunition to capitalist industry to support the securitization of the state by developing surveillance technology to monitor conversations, movements, lifestyles, and to profile people on that basis, further curtailing basic freedoms. 20 years after the dramatic collapse of the Twin Towers, the world is still smoldering from the scourge of the global war on terror that was launched, turning the world into a battlefield. The perpetrators of injustice on an unprecedented scale are not held accountable, and survivors are yet to see justice. The August 2021 Taliban takeover and the withdrawal of the American and NATO troops, as chaotic as it appeared to audiences around the world, was not unexpected. From 2001, attempts were made to broker deals between the United States and the Taliban. The United Arab Emirates had been one of 3 countries to maintain ties to the Taliban in the immediate aftermath of the US invasion. By 2020, Qatar's overtures to the Taliban and the US began to overshadow the UAE. Qatar's history of mediation of conflicts in Darfur and Yemen, for example, as well as their determination to maintain an independent, balanced foreign policy, wielded the desired result as the Taliban opened a representative office in Doha with the purpose of engaging in negotiations with the Americans and the Afghan government. The first direct talks between the USA and the Taliban with Qatari mediation was held in 2013, although then President Hamid Karzai objected to the Taliban being referred to as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. By 2018, high-level Taliban members, including founding member and now Deputy Prime Minister Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, were released from imprisonment and they joined the negotiations in Doha. On 29th of February 2020, corresponding with the 5th of Rajab 1441 Hijri, the Taliban and the USA concluded an agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan. The United States committed to the withdrawal from Afghanistan of all military forces of the United States, its allies, coalition partners, including all non-diplomatic civilian personnel, private military security contractors, trainers, advisors, and supporting services personnel within 14 months of the agreement. As a confidence-building measure, the USA agreed to release 5,000 Taliban members. In addition, the USA also applied pressure on the client regime of Ashraf Ghani and former President Hamid Karzai and Abdullah Abdullah to engage in intra-Afghan talks with the Taliban. The latter two agreed, But Ashraf Ghani was obstructionist, hoping to hold on to his position from which he could continue enriching himself and his cronies through corruption. The Taliban, in turn, agreed inter alia to maintaining security in Afghanistan and preventing any organizations or individuals from using Afghanistan as a launch pad for attacks on countries. Furthermore, the USA undertook to seek economic cooperation for reconstruction with the new post-settlement Afghan Islamic government, as determined by intra-Afghan dialogue and negotiations, and agreed not to intervene in Afghanistan's internal affairs. That, however, is not taking place. The timeline for withdrawal was clearly set as May 2021, yet the USA requested an extension under the Biden administration to 11 September 2021. This was changed to 31 August. The hysteria and the scramble for departure at the last minute created the impression that the Taliban swept to power suddenly, but this was not the case. The dramatic unfolding was more a result of poor planning on the part of the USA and the cowardly departure from Kabul by Ashraf Ghani. Even the Taliban were taken by surprise with his fleeing, as only foot soldiers were on the outskirts of Kabul at the time, whilst most of the leadership was still in Doha, only to arrive days after the capital fell. Upon the hasty departure, the USA purged the data they had mined of almost 80% of the Afghan population who were under surveillance. Whilst retreating, military hardware was abandoned, but rendered useless as military assets at the airport were destroyed. In the final hours, following an ISIL attack on the airport, the Americans left a devastating departing message by conducting a drone strike that killed 9 civilians, including 6 children, 4 of whom were under the age of 4. With deep apprehension and fears expressed by urban Afghans, and with the world watching, the Taliban has a long road ahead to establish security, governance, and build confidence amongst its people. As the Taliban has announced their interim government, the responses from the rest of the world have been critical, noting particularly the appointment of former Guantanamo Bay detainees and individuals on terror lists to ministerial positions. The global community remains divided, as evidenced by the departing UN Security Council Resolution 2593, meant to apply pressure on the Taliban to ensure safe passage and free travel for anyone wanting to leave Afghanistan. China and Russia appear to be positioning themselves for engagement with the new leadership. China had begun secret meetings with the Taliban as early as 2014, and overtures were made public more recently in June 2021. This week, China announced $14 billion investment in Afghanistan as part of their Greater Belt and Road Initiative. Meanwhile, the Afghan economy is in tatters, as the USA, the IMF, and World Bank have frozen the central bank assets, holding the new Taliban leadership to ransom and continuing the sanctions against them. Without adequate access to funds, the Taliban will face considerable threats to its rulership, as the country is already donor dependent, and this would risk the illicit economy and drug trade again from gaining strength. With high poverty levels, sanctions, displacement of people, and the brain drain as a result of educated Afghans scrambling to leave, the new government is likely to face increased instability. Re-emergence of warlords, criminal syndicates, and terrorist groups is expected. Without external support, the Taliban will not be able to consolidate its power base. Qatar remains the broker as former coalition members seek to work through the Gulf state for future engagement. Turkey has offered to assist with getting the airport back to functioning order, and Pakistan remains a close neighbor that has been intimately affected by the wars over the last 4 decades. Another civil war or attempts at coups, as well as instigation from outside forces, must be expected, as a stable Afghanistan is not in the interests of all. In the immediate term, the humanitarian situation is dire, and Afghanistan is in urgent need of medical equipment, medicine, and food. The international community will not be able to ignore the plight of the Afghans and cannot render an entire population helpless because of the political changes that are beyond their control. The Taliban appears to have matured. in the last 2 decades, and their leadership exposure to the world through their office in Qatar has surely impacted on their outlook. Ideologically, they remain conservative and firm in their conviction of establishing Islamic rule, but perhaps seeing another country with laws inspired by Sharia but progressive in its inclusion of women may inspire the Taliban to have renewed respect and understanding for the role that women can play in nation building within the prescripts of Sharia. Access to education is pivotal for the development of any society. Yesterday marked the International Day to Protect Education from Attack, an initiative launched by Qatar's mother of the Emir, Her Highness Sheikha Musa bint Nasser al-Misnad. With the devastation that the 4 decades of war has brought, Afghan schools, particularly those outside the urban centers, have been destroyed. To rebuild a nation, the schools must be rebuilt. Theological debate will surely arise in terms of the interpretations of Sharia and how to manage a country with a more educated and globally connected populace. Drawing on the historic Medina Charter and recalling the treaties and peace agreements signed by our Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Taliban offered blanket amnesty to all Afghans who had collaborated with the coalition. This was a critical confidence-building measure, but reports of foot soldiers acting brutally will have to be dealt with decisively by the leadership. Training, community outreach, post-conflict reconstruction and development, and the building of social cohesion must be the main priorities for the interim government. The holding of the Loya Jirga, or Tribal Council, is a tradition that imbues democratic principles and should be respected by the Taliban to ensure stability. It is also through the Loya Jirga that tribal patriarchy can possibly be challenged and transformed, though this may be a very long process. Diplomatic recognition will likely be withheld until the Taliban proves itself, but the world cannot expect to view Afghanistan from the prism of Western principles. The West and the USA are not the guardians of justice. They cannot hold the Taliban to account for that which they themselves violate. As the withdrawal from Afghanistan has concluded, we must also be cognizant of the shifting of the global war on terror to African shores. Joe Biden, in his address upon the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan, made it quite clear that Africa is the new frontier for counterterrorism. It is our responsibility as Muslims to understand these dynamics, to question the motives and the root causes of resistance to capitalist ventures closer to home. We must work to dismantle the global war on terror architecture that is entrenched even here at home and stand for justice. The Taliban's victory over the empire was only possible by Allah's will. May Allah guide the new leadership in establishing good governance, making sound decisions that hold perpetrators of injustice accountable, and establish peace and justice. As Allah says in the Quran, O you who believe, uphold justice and bear witness to Allah, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or your close relatives, whether the person is rich or poor. Allah can best take care of both. Refrain from following your own desires so that you can act justly. If you distort or neglect justice, Allah is fully aware of what you do. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Jazakallah khair for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.